This is the DRF Players Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the June 14th Flag Day edition of the DRF Players Podcast. I'll tell you a little embarrassing story. At the start of last week's June 7th podcast, I said it was the June 14th podcast, and I almost gave producer Charlie Zeggers a heart attack because today's his daughter's birthday. So I gave him that second of panic that he had somehow missed his child's birthday. Not good stuff. Not good stuff from me hosting. I am your host, Peter Thomas Fornatale, back with you. And we're with the usual crew plus one. We're with everybody who participated in our DRF Players Podcast Triple Crown Challenge. And they are starting with the stalwart of the program at DRF Formulator himself, Mike Hogan. How are you doing today, Mike?
I'm doing great, Pete. How are you?
I'm doing well. I think I'm going to start introducing you as Mike Hogan of Forest Hills, Queens.
Okay,
In our second chair, another regular. You know him. You love him. You see his giant picture intimidating you from the side of the screen as you're playing on the new DRF Tournaments platform. He is Jonathon Kinchen. How are you today, Jonathan?
I'm doing well. It's always a good day when you can start it off laying in bed watching top-class racing. So
we'll get to that. We're going to have plenty more on that in a minute. It is Royal Ascot week in addition to being the week after the Belmont Stakes. Our third guest, last but not least, he is the bloodstock agent behind Fighting Girl Stables. He's the head of the NTRA Players Committee. He's one of the most respected tournament players in the world. He is Chris Larmey. How are you doing today, Chris?
Oh, great, Pete. Your intros are always far too flattering, but I love the podcast, and I really appreciate being able to participate from time to time. So it's great to be here.
You are like you're sort of more than a semi-regular. You're not quite a regular, but you're more than a semi-regular. You're in that sort of sweet spot. Well, there's so much to talk about today, but I think Jonathan tipped our hand as to where we should begin the show, because just about half an hour before we started recording the show, we got to watch Tepin in the Queen Anne Stakes. And boy, was this a performance that I think I'll remember for the rest of my life. I mean, here is this Canadian/American filly. She's accomplished so much on our shores. But going over to a meeting like Royal Ascot, this is another depth of magnitude difficulty out of control. You're dealing with ground much softer than anything she's ever run on. There was a headwind there this morning, and meaning that the horses who weren't going to get cover, like predictably Tepin did not, were at a little bit of a disadvantage. Despite all these things, despite this seeming like it was maybe more of an owner-driven spot than a trainer-driven spot, and we've talked about how we feel about that many times on the podcast. Despite all those hurdles, in the UK betting, I think she was about 4-1 last week. With all that additional information against her, drifted out to about 6.5-1 by the off time of the race. None of it mattered. Tepin gamely getting the job done, fighting off a better field than anything she's ever faced before, in my opinion. I'll start with you, Mike. What did you think of this effort by Tepin?
I mean, I said it right before you joined when Chris and I were the only ones on here. No Lasix, no nasal strip, no problem. I mean,
I forgot about that. She didn't have her equipment either.
Yeah, anything she throws gets thrown at her. Traveling, soft ground, you name it. She's good. She is good, and I think we got to start talking about not just. I mean, I think it's a given now. She's a lock for the Hall of Fame. We got to start talking like perhaps best turf filly we've seen in North America in X number of years. And our buddy Matt Bernier put out a pretty hot take right after she won. He said, I think she might even be better than Wise Dan. I don't know if we want to go there, but
well, let's make that. Let's use that as the next question. I gave Mike the softball, Jonathan. So I'm going to give. I don't want to do this to our guest. I'm going to just give it to you. Tepin or Wise Dan?
No, I'm watching Matt get crushed on Twitter. He's getting attacked from all. There's no way I'm going in that road. No, I mean, look, it's different. I don't like comparing greats, and while one of them is still in the middle of their career and one of them is done. I prefer it to be when they're both in the same spot. I think they're both great for lots of different reasons. I've been known to hop on the fence from time to time, but I really do honestly believe that it's better to compare horses or players in sports when they're at the same point of their career. Let's look at LeBron and Michael Jordan when LeBron is done, not with LeBron in the middle of his career. So same with Tepin and Wise Dan. Let's see how it ends.
Once again, as when I asked Jonathon, Zenyatta, Rachel, Alexandra, make sure you pick all the splinters off your backside from sitting on that fence, Jonathon. Chris, I'll ask you a variation on the same question. I mean, actually, I'll give my opinion, which is I think you almost have to rate her higher than Wise Dan based on this achievement today. Now, granted, it's hard to say this within half an hour of being after it, but I'm kind of with Matt Bernier. It's always my opinion that the horses who test themselves the most deserve credit over horses that hit the achievable goals. To me, this was, a few years ago, I would say it would be practically inconceivable that a USA horse is going to go over there and win the Queen Anne, let alone the specifics of the Tepin situation. So Chris, you break we had one abstain and we have one vote for Tepin. We'll let you guide this conversation as to what you think of these two turf greats of the last few years, Chris.
Well, I will. I'll kind of circle around a little bit. I think from an overall career perspective, you still have to give Wise Dan the edge, but from the run that Tepin's on now, I think, is probably better than any run Wise Dan had. And one of the things I really appreciate about Tepin right now is, they're not babying her. They're running her every 3 or 4 weeks and against the top competition, shipping all over the place. I mean, you just don't see that nowadays with top-level horses. So to me, the run she's on is comparable to anything I've seen in any U.S. turf horse in memory. In terms of her career, I agree with Jonathon. You have to wait. You can't compare her to someone like Wise Dan or John Henry, who had an extended run of top-level performances. But in terms of the run she's had in this last year, I think it's the equal of anything I've seen.
Let me ask you guys this. I'm a very frequent, again, another area where former co-host of podcast, and I agree, talking about Matt Bernier again, I've been the first one to say that I feel like as a group, the European turf horses are far superior to the USA turf horses. I think we've talked about that a lot on the show. Does a result like this, I have an opinion on this, but I'll ask you, Mike Hogan, first, does it mean that I have to change my tune about that?
I don't know. I think what I'll say is this. You can't necessarily, one single data point does not change a larger body of sample size. For instance, there are outliers. No matter, there are certainly good and have been very good dirt horses from overseas that could compete with and maybe even beat the dirt horses in North America. A horse like Tepin can compete with and beat the best Europeans. That doesn't necessarily mean things are changing. I think in general, and we see it all the time, and we'll talk about Flintshire a little bit, you see these horses that maybe aren't winning or they're competing at the top level, they're getting beat overseas, they come to America and they crush our turf horses. In general, I think that's still the case.
That was basically going to be my take, that obviously I think I need to amend that statement that at the top levels we obviously do have some that can hang, but I still feel like I don't totally have to eat crow on that statement. Jonathon, am I just being a weasel?
Yeah, I mean, our horses are bred for dirt. Their horses are bred for turf. It's inherent that on most occasion their turf horses are going to be better than ours, and our dirt horses are going to be better than theirs. And so I think it's pretty simple. It's, every now and then there's going to be horses that excel, and overcome those, those prejudices, I guess. But, I think it's probably safe to say that their turf horses are still better than ours as a whole.
Chris, I'm very curious where you think, just in your own personal reckoning with Tepin's career not being over, despite the run that she's on, what do you expect? And you've also made the point before about how much she's run this year. Do you expect that this will continue? I mean, do you think we're going to see a little bit of a layoff and then just boom, 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 regular races in the fall? What are we going to see from Tepin the rest of this year?
It's funny because Mike and I were talking about the same thing. I don't know. She's already accomplished an awful lot, and it's only June, so I don't know. I'm not sure where they're going to point her next. Maybe they'll run her again in Europe. Maybe they bring her back and freshen her up and point the Breeders' Cup. I really have no idea. Seems like they have all sorts of options.
Jonathon, did you get to see Norm Cassie in a top hat? That's the other thing I want to know. Friend of the podcast, Norm Cassie.
I did see a quick cut of him, yeah. And I saw him on Snapchat.
How'd he look?
Did
he pull it off?
Yeah, absolutely. I saw him on Snapchat, like showing him trying on the hat. So I kind of saw it earlier this week. But as far as Tepin's remainder of the year, I would imagine that this is no inside information, but I would imagine that she's going to take a little bit of break off of this, point to Saratoga, and then point to Keeneland, and then run in the Breeders' Cup out at Santa Anita. I've tried to convince, and I think Nick Tamero has as well, to convince Norm to run her just because I think it'd be cool in the Filly and Mare turf, because it starts down the hill. It's on a quick surface at Santa Anita, so I don't think the added distance would be any issue for her. But I would imagine off of this performance and off of last year's win that we'll just see her in the mile.
That's a kind of a fun idea. That hadn't even occurred to me. Well, hopefully we'll get a chance to have Norm on the show maybe next week when he gets back from what I hope will now be 5 days of partying over in the UK. But knowing Horseman, he'll be back at the barn tomorrow morning. The way these things go. Well, now, of course, Tepin was not meant to be what we led off today's show with, but that bit of news superseded the original running order. We were supposed to talk about the Belmont Stakes, and I want to start off with just massive props and congratulations to Mike Hogan for coming up with Creator, giving Creator out to the people. Lots of nice comments on Twitter about that. Mike, were you able to make any money on this race?
Yes, fortunately I did. I stupidly, and we'll talk about this a little later, I was stubborn and I left Frosted off my pick 4, so I had 3 out of 4 there, but I at least had the exacta with Creator and Destin, so that helped.
That definitely, that does take the sting out. Another person very successful in the Belmont Stakes, we mentioned before, Fighting Girl Stable, one of the 4 arms. Well, actually, here's how it went down if you weren't listening pre-Triple Crown. Jonathon, Mike, and I drafted 5 horses each to compete, getting points for first, seconds, and thirds throughout the Triple Crown series. Chris was too nice to say that he thought we did such a poor job that he wanted to join in. He just thought that there was enough out there that he could create his own stable of 5 from the remaining horses out there. He did that. He wasn't looking so hot coming into the Belmont Stakes, but then he ends up not only with the winner Creator, but also a Fighting Girl team member, Destin, getting second. Pretty impressive stuff. Chris, how did it feel to go from last to first like that?
It was nice. I mean, the reason I wanted to jump in wasn't because I thought you guys had done a poor job of selecting the horses you had chosen. I just thought this crop is pretty balanced. I didn't think Nyquist stood out, and I just thought there was an opportunity to jump in, and over the course of the Triple Crown, I thought these horses would probably end up beating one another, and that's what happened. I didn't necessarily think I had a better opinion than the rest of you. I just thought, the leftovers looked a lot like the ones you had chosen, so I thought it was worth a shot. I knew that I wouldn't probably not pick up anything in the Preakness because I went for some closers like Creator and Sudden Breaking News, figuring maybe they'd hit the board in the Derby and they'd skip the Preakness and go to the Belmont. It sort of worked out that way. Unfortunately, they both had really tough trips in the Derby, and Sudden Breaking News just missed hitting the board. But then, they did come back and run well in the Belmont. Destin was really the horse I thought was the star of my stable, and that was a tough beat for me because I would have made much more money on the Belmont if he had held on. But thanks to an incredibly perfect ride by Irad Ortiz. I mean, if you watch the replay of that race, you could not ride Creator any better than he did. I mean, if he had made any other decisions than the ones he made, the horse would not have won. I mean, it was just a perfect ride, and that guy can ride. He's going to be, around for a long time.
He's terrific. I've said his best work reminds me of Ramon Dominguez. I think that was an example of that. I thought the Asmussen quote was great. He sounded more like a professional horse player almost than a horse trainer when he said, oh gosh, what was the exact line? It was something to the effect of he saved yards and won by inches, and I thought that was an accurate description of that. So Mike, in the end, our contest, did you do the final math? Do you have a tabulation?
I do. It's not quite, to paraphrase one of the bands we've mentioned on here before, the Minutemen. It's not quite a three-way tie for last because Jonathon Kinchen has the big bagel there. I think, Jonathan, maybe you're possibly, hindsight's 20/20. Maybe you're rethinking that first pick of Brody's Cause, huh?
No, I'm over. That's what I do.
But it was, I guess we'll call it a three-way tie for third because we have Pete, me, and Chris all with 30 points. Pete getting the 20 points for the win in the Kentucky Derby for Nyquist, and then 2 5-point third-place finishes, one with Gunrunner and one with Nyquist as well. I had 20 points, 10 for second in the Derby with Exaggerator, and then 20 for him winning the Preakness. I got shut out with all my other horses in there. And then as you mentioned, Chris had 0 coming in, but that Exacta in the Belmont gave him 20 and 10, which put him in a tie first with Pete and me. So three-way tie for first. I don't know if that means we all won or nobody won.
I think we all won.
I think Chris won. He got the leftovers and beat it.
Yeah, that's right. Oh, that's a good point. The fighting girl gets it done. You're right. You're absolutely right. Quite the choke job from Looms Boldly Stables. I put myself at about 1-9 after having the first and third in the Derby. Couldn't see out the trip. Yeah, Chris is the clear winner, but I still think we still owe Mike Hogan a bobblehead of his own from winning last year. So you're definitely bobblehead worthy, Mike. And I think since I'm doing it anyway, why not, Jonathan? I'll get bobbleheads of us too.
Hey, I deserve a bobblehead for being right about Exaggerator being a one-turn horse.
All right, I'm going to give you a hard time about this. I'm going to officially give you a hard time about this. We're now talking about a horse. First, I'll give you my opinion on why the horse didn't run. I think it was over the top. We heard all those training reports about working with pinned ears and pulling towards the outside rail. We saw how rank he got. I mean, I think it's a little crazy to say that it was the extra turn that beat this horse, who 3 times in his 3 biggest efforts of his career have won 2-turn races. I want to hear this. I want to hear one more defense of you of why you think this is right. I'm basically giving you a chance to walk it back, Jonathan. But if I know you, you'll double down.
No, he's a good horse. Don't get me wrong. I just think that he's going to excel when they finally cut him back to one-turn races. I think he'll win next year's Met Mile. I think that he's the type of horse that has been flattered by the scenarios in which he's gotten in the 3 races prior to the Belmont, which were all on wet surfaces and were all with supersonic paces in front of him. That's all. And I just feel like he was flattered by those scenarios, and his prowess as a 2-turn horse has been exaggerated, no pun intended, by those 3 races.
Let's talk about the race from some other perspectives. Chris, we'll start with you. Is there a particular horse, leaving aside the top 2, anything else you saw in the race of interest worth note that you'll take in your sort of handicapping piggy bank and carry with you to future efforts?
Oh, definitely. I mean, Governor Malibu, you have to upgrade his performance. He had a brutal stretch run. He got rabbited. He tried to go outside the rabbit, and the rabbit cut him off. He tried to go inside the rabbit cut him off. I mean, Creator got, and Gettysburg kind of tag teamed Governor Malibu there in the stretch. I don't think he was going to win, but he certainly would have finished better. Probably would have outfinished Lanny for third. He ran a good race. He kind of had a perfect trip until the stretch, but boy, it was a brutal stretch run for him.
Rosario, I think, learned a little something about how Paco Lopez rides. I thought that was very old school by Paco, who, when out of horse, still seemed interested in not letting somebody come up the rail. in that spot. So I definitely see where you're coming from there. Jonathon, how about you? Any other thoughts to come out of the Belmont Stakes?
Yeah, nothing that like I'm screaming I can't wait to bet back. I mean, obviously Governor Malibu had the trouble, but I just think that it was really interesting and cool that the connections of Lonnie they brought the horse over here. They did things their own way, and they probably were made fun of and teased probably more than any other horse on the Triple Crown Trail, and they just kind of stuck with it. And I'm glad that they got a piece of one of these races. It feels like it was deserved just on kind of their perseverance. So I thought that was interesting for sure.
It was a great story. Mike, well, actually, I'll ask you the same question I asked those two, and then I have a question for the group, unless Mike happens to bring it up in his answer. Thoughts coming out of this year's Belmont Stakes?
Well, for me, like I said, I had that exacta with the two top finishers, but there was a point at the mid-stretch where I thought Lonnie was going to run by both of them.
Larry Colmus.
Yeah, so I was a little worried there. I thought he ran on really well. I mean, I think as a horse who a lot of people had doubts and certainly had a little bit of we'll just call it an uncharacteristic training style leading up into the all three of the races. He acquitted himself well on the Triple Crown Trail, and hopefully we'll see him again at some point in the future back in the States. But I think there are a couple decent horses. Stradivari probably was a little better than he ran on Saturday. Might not want to go quite the 12
furlongs. Doesn't want to go that far. Doesn't want to go that far.
Right.
I could see in my seat where I was sitting in the grandstand, Mike, was like right where he started to, it looked like he was in position, and then he just emptied out all over the stretch. I just don't think he wanted any part of that distance.
Yep, exactly. But yeah, I mean, despite not having a Triple Crown on the line, despite not having a Derby winner in the race, it was a pretty good field. It ended up being a pretty strong race. I think there's some good horses to come out of it. I don't think it's one of the weaker Belmont Stakes we've seen in the last 10 years or so. I think there's some good horses in there.
All right, here's a question that I've heard a lot of back and forth about. My opinion, I don't know if it's the majority or the minority, but I know there's people on both sides of this. I feel with the way that the race was run, and I feel for you, Chris, saying that it would have been, Destin would have been a better result for you. I feel like the Rabbit did, in fact, cost him the race. I want everybody's take on this, starting with you, Chris. Do you agree?
Well, first of all, I would just love to have heard the conversation between Elliott Walden and Todd Flintshire before the Belmont. I mean, it probably went something like this. Elliott says, hey, Todd, I'd like to run Gettysburg in the Belmont. And Todd Flintshire probably said, what? You're kidding, right? You're not kidding, are you? Why would you want to do that? And then, I just see how that went down. And so that was kind of strange for sure. And I do think it had an impact. He didn't run off or anything, but, to me, Destin.
They were very honest fractions. I thought it was, if Destin goes, when you lose by an inch, if he can go just a little bit slower, I just got to believe he wins. That's the way I saw it.
Yeah, well, that, between the Rabbit and just the perfect ride by Irad Ortiz, I mean, anything other than that, I think Destin wins the Belmont. And you got to figure the ironies there because, Fletcher's first Belmont win was a nose over Curlin, who was trained by Asmussen. So Asmussen gets Fletcher's horse as a Rabbit and then beats Fletcher by a nose in the Belmont. I mean, you can't make that stuff up.
It's rich. It's very textured stuff. Jonathon, where do you stand on the issue of if the Rabbit was the deciding factor in this year's Belmont?
Without a doubt. I mean, they went, in my opinion, not in my opinion, the clock says they went a second faster to the half than they did in the mile-and-a-half Brooklyn. So to think that Destin could have slowed it down just even, 2/5 of a second, I feel like that would have made the difference for him to get up and win.
Mike, are you on seeing this the same way as we are? Do you have I'm hoping that you do, a contrary point of view?
Yeah, I think, look, maybe he affected the race, but, I think Destin still sat a good trip. I think he ran his race. It's not like the pace completely collapsed. I don't know. I'm not 100% convinced that the rabbit was the difference. But I'm with Chris. I would have loved to have heard that conversation. And the irony is pretty funny, especially when you note that right after the race, Elliot Walden said, "Okay, now Gettysburg's going back into the barn of Todd Pletcher." So
that's amazing.
I've
never seen anything like that before. So I mean, is it as simple as Pletcher just being like, "Look, dude, your horse, you do what you want, but you ain't doing that in my name against the interests of my horse." And then maybe after the race, it's like, okay, well, yeah, you can have it back. It's very.
No,
I've never seen.
He didn't take the horse back. No, Pletcher refused to take the horse back. I don't think he was.
Oh, okay. I didn't see that part of the story.
Really?
Yeah. Well, you have to figure it. The owners of Destin, would be kind of upset if he loaned.
Yeah, it would look like a setup.
And then took him back. I mean,
right.
It was weird enough, but for him to take it back would have been even weirder.
So
no, he's not back with Flintshire.
Okay, but that was as far as WinStar was concerned, that would have been A-okay, it sounds like.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
It's just kind of a funny situation. But good on you, Chris, for having the up-to-date information on that one. Of course, there were lots of other great races on this sort of summer Breeders' Cup, early summer Breeders' Cup weekend at Belmont Park. Oh, I want to make a constructive criticism. I'm all about, I think in racing too often there's these knee-jerk reactions, and people just get upset and they go like right to nuclear. Oh, that I'm never going to go to X place again, blah, blah, blah. That's just silly. It's in the racing business especially, I think we can all benefit from each other's knowledge. And that's why, just to give a perfectly relevant example, maybe a little too close to the bone, but the heck with it, I've already started. If somebody has something to say about the new DRF tournaments platform, I really want to hear it. I want to know, as somebody who works at DRF on the inside, I'm in a position to get a voice at least to decision makers. So if you want to give me that feedback, I'm all about it. But I don't want somebody just going nuclear about some problem they had. Look, everybody's trying hard, and specifically in that instance, things are improving and only going to get better. And it's with that spirit in mind that I make this next comment. I happened to go down to the paddock for the Belmont Stakes. It was pretty crowded around there. There were people who had camped out all day with the hope of seeing these top-class horses coming by. And, of course, at the top of the list are the horses running in the Belmont Stakes. When it came time for the Belmont Stakes, rather than parade the horses around the paddock in a normal way so the fans can see them, the horses went straight out to the track. This prompted, much booing and consternation from people standing in the ring, and I get it. I think it's something that Naira, who I felt like did a great job on the weekend, I think they really need to consider the fans. I think one of the things that makes horse racing fans and makes the experience of racing great is to get up within a couple of feet of these unbelievable equine athletes. And I don't know what the logic is of denying the fans that. I remember in the old days at Saratoga, Chris, you'll probably remember this because you're old like me, that when there would be a grade one, they would give the horses an extra turn in the paddock to give people a second chance to get up close to these great stars of the game. Now, maybe they don't need to do the 2 walk-arounds, but to me, you've got to do one. You've got to do one. And for them to go straight out there, I just thought that was one thing I'd really like Naira to take a look at for the future and do something about, because the fans do deserve a little bit better than that. Okay, end of filibuster. I just wanted to make sure that I threw that in there. I hadn't seen anybody talk about it. I don't know. All the reporters are probably busy. I figured I would just I would try to speak for those fans who stood at the rail there and got denied. But of course, we mentioned early summer Breeders' Cup. A lot of great races going on. Mike Hogan, we'll start with you. What was the big race? What was the best, most impressive, however you want to say it, performance on Belmont Stakes Day?
Well, I guess you got to go with Frosted, right? I mean, based on the length or number of lengths that he beat that field, I think Dave Grenning said he didn't have confirmation, but the feeling was that was the largest victory by number of lengths ever in the Met Mile. Based on Beyer speed figure, which was a 123. That was the top one we've seen this decade. I think you got to go back to St. Liam and Commentator to get a Beyer speed figure that high in a mile or further. So that's a ways ago. It's been 10 years since we've seen a buyer that high. So I guess all benchmarks, that would be the most impressive effort. That said, I think some people have said, well, who'd he beat?
Oh dear, Jonathan, that plays nicely into my next question, actually, which is because I did hear a comment along those lines. Well, maybe he would have been third to Honor Code last year. I don't buy that for a second. What's your thought?
No, he Honor Code wasn't catching him last year. He ran huge, and so I think the biggest winner this weekend, this is a joke, obviously, is American Pharaoh. With Frosted proving how good of a horse he is, and running behind American Pharaoh 4 times last year. So, no, I thought Flintshire was amazing. I tweeted that I don't think he'll lose a turf race in America in 2016. I think he's brilliant. I think he's much better than these. He's tactical. He's got an unbelievable turn of foot, and I don't think he'll lose another turf race in America in 2016.
He was pretty unbelievable, and this was a day the rail dropped. Presumably the inside paths on the turf running faster and therefore more favorable to speed. He's rallying wide. None of it mattered for Flintshire. Chris, let me ask you about both those horses in order. We'll start with Frosted. How impressed were you by him, and does it make you think any better of American Pharaoh for how easily he handled Frosted multiple times last year?
I thought Frosted was, he ran an incredible race. He freaked. I think it just shows that maybe, his wheelhouse is, middle distances, and like a lot of 3-year-olds, they try the Triple Crown Trail, and they try to go 1.25 miles, and some of them can handle it and some can't. So I think a lot of it was just that, he found his wheelhouse, and also, his trainer is phenomenal in New York, but you get outside New York and he just doesn't do as well. Mike's talked about this on the podcast before. His statistics prove that out, and it's not just a small sample size. I've been playing that angle for 5 years or more, so I think everything was, in Frosted's favor. I don't know if it really flatters American Pharaoh. It's a year later, it's a different distance, and I don't know if I would say it has anything to do with that. But I certainly would have loved to have seen American Pharaoh run as a 4-year-old because horses mature and they don't peak until, the end of their 4-year-old year typically. So we never saw the best of American Pharaoh, and that's part of the disappointment of, American racing and the emphasis on 3-year-olds and the fact that they tend to go to stud right after the 3-year-old season. It's really disappointing. But, I was impressed with Frosted, but I don't know if it really means much in terms of the grand scheme of things with American Pharaoh.
The only point I'll make that's a little contrary to that is I feel like I take the point. It's a different kind of race. It's a different year. But just the idea that a horse who had that inherent talent, obviously this was the best race he ever rode. And I think that you can go back and look at that Dubai World Cup and conjure some excuses from his placement on the track and the kickback he took there, that was also a pretty strong race. But just that Pharaoh, I feel like the ease with which he was able to handle a horse capable of that leap forward, it does make me think between the huge figure that Pharaoh earned in the Breeders' Cup Classic, and now the fact that when somebody says, well, who did Pharaoh beat, you'd say, oh yeah, the horse that won the mile the next year by a pole. I do think historically it might shine a little bit in the Pharaoh's favor. What do you think, Mike?
Well, it's funny. The first thing I thought, and I tweeted this out after the race, was exactly what Chris said, which is Frosted's performance made me really wish we could have seen American Pharaoh as a 4-year-old, because I agree with Chris. We didn't see the best of him. I think horses do mature. I agree that, it's like the equivalent of a 23-year-old baseball player or basketball player retiring. Yeah, sure, we saw some great performances from American Pharaoh, but, the performance that Frost had put down Saturday, I think it absolutely validates American Pharaoh's form. I think it absolutely makes me wish that we got to see some of these horses continue on, because let's face it, the older horses, the best older horses that we see are either ones that wash out on the Triple Crown Trail, don't make it or start later, like Honor Code, for instance, had such a long layoff. If Honor Code had a fantastic 3-year-old year, we might not have seen him as a 4-year-old. Or horses like California Chrome, who maybe aren't as fashionable to be retired after their 3-year-old season, so they have to kind of continue on to build that resume. The really, really brilliant ones often don't get a chance to show their best when they mature, and that's a shame.
Well, it's interesting you say this. Before I was involved as I am, like as a racing industry person, I would frequently say that I felt, and I'm not sure that I disagree with this, it's along the lines of the point that you and Chris both made, that in a way the Triple Crown races are a bit of a glass ceiling for horse racing, in that, yes, that's the top, that's where people are the most interested, but they lead to this economic situation that you guys are sort of decrying. But as I became more involved in the industry and some of the politics and difficult things in the horse racing industry, I've come to see the Triple Crown races a little bit differently. And I've come to see them as one of the few things that undisputably work well in the racing industry, that we have this interest built in. This is when people are caring. It may still be a bit of a glass ceiling in like a theoretical sense, but I think in the real world, it's one of the things that's working. It's not going to change. So rather than decry it, I'll instead choose to accept it and then just celebrate all the more when we get opportunities with horses like, just to name a few, California Chrome and Beholder and Tepin, who come back to race beyond age 3. Jonathan, what do you think about this issue?
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I mean, it's a tough thing. You understand why horses go where they are. It's a business, and as horse players, we play in tournaments and make bets that are good financial investments for us. We're not just betting 1 to 9 shots all the time because it's fun and that's what the sport needs. And so to expect these owners and breeders to leave millions and millions of dollars on the track because it's what's best for the sport, I think is a little bit unfair. So look, do I want American Pharoah on the racetrack? Selfishly, I do, but I'm also not at risk of losing hundreds of millions of dollars.
Yeah,
Either of you boys have a follow-up on that? Yeah.
Yeah, and that my point isn't that the system is broken or anything. And I understand exactly why. The industry has set it up so that they actually would lose money if they continued racing American Pharoah, and I don't expect anybody to put themselves in a position where they're going to lose money in a business. I'm not knocking anybody for making the decisions. I'm more just talking about, like, as a sport, this is the only one where it's set up. I mean, Michael Jordan sure retired and he continued to make money in endorsements, but he doesn't. By retiring, he doesn't stand to make more than he would on the court. And I think this is the only sport where that's the case. And I understand why that is. It's a shame. I mean, look, Frosted was arguably, the 3rd, maybe 4th best 3-year-old we saw last year. And now he is certainly in the conversation of one of the top older horses.
You think he's as far down the list as 3rd or 4th? Who else are you?
Yes.
Maybe I'm just spacing. Who are you? Who comes to mind immediately?
Run Happy in Dortmund. Arguably.
Dortmund over Frosted? That seems like a conversation.
Yeah, well, I mean, think about it. How many Grade 1s did Frosted win as a 3-year-old? Granted, he was running him against American Pharoah in a few of them. But
that's why I don't like that metric for that question.
Well,
let's ask the other guys what they think about that. Am I interrupting you?
That's why I said arguably. I mean, I'd say they were. You could make a case for one over the other, but I don't see him as being in one of the top 2, certainly.
As long as, I mean, I think you got to go AP. I think if you're ranking those 4, everybody's going to go AP, Run Happy, 1, 2. How do you fill out that top quartet, Chris Larmey, with Dortmund or Frosted, or are we forgetting somebody from last year's 3-year-old crop?
I really have no idea.
Not the way you think about the world?
Yeah, well, my point I was trying to make wasn't really to try to decry the economic of the racing, but just make people understand that 3-year-olds are like high school players in the human terms. And when we're seeing them with these good performances, even later in the 3-year-old year, they're like, Mike said, they're college players. We never get to see them as pros when they don't run as 4- and 5-year-olds. And so all I was trying to point out is American Pharoah, as good as he was the 3-year-old, he might have been able to just, wow us as a 4- and a 5-year-old. And it's not unusual to see someone like Frosted improve, between that 3-year-old and 4-year-old year significantly. And some horses improve at greater rates than others. That's why, I don't like to try to draw too much from about the year before based on what happens the next year, because, some horses are good at 2, and some are good at 3, and some are good at 4, and, they improve at different rates.
You weren't wowed enough by the you weren't wowed enough by the Breeders' Cup Classic there with the Pharoah?
Well, I was, but that's just saying that was just scratching the surface of that horse's talent. Potentially, he could have had much better performances, this year, and we'll never know. Same with Secretariat. As good as he was, he might have been even better probably would have been even better at 4. I mean, look at great horses like Affirm and Spectacular Bid and Seattle Slew, and you look at their 3-year-old years, and they were good. They were a dominant horse in their, in their crop, but they were much better as 4-year-olds than they were as 3-year-olds. Much better. If you look at their speed figures and times that they ran, I mean, I saw a Spectacular Bid run at Santa Anita, just an incredible race, and he was good as a 3-year-old, but he was incredible as a 4-year-old. So
that's a great
point.
What
we're missing. That's what we're missing.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely a fair point. The horse for me that I'm wishing we got to see run in his older years, and Jonathon probably already knows where I'm going with this because he was with me when we got a chance to see him down at Ashford. But just the way he's changed physically from the time he was 2 and 3 years old is Uncle Mo. I just think seeing him, I think that the way that he moved and then the way that he grew up, the things he could have done on the racetrack would have been really special. Jonathon, I'll ask you a handicapping question. Are there any things that you look for in particular in a horse that portend improvement as that horse gets older?
Not necessarily. I mean, I guess you try to figure out why it happened. I mean, there's a lot of reasons why it could happen, and kind of to Chris's point earlier, like with Frosted, is it the idea that he is actually being asked to do something that he's more comfortable doing? Is that why he's improved so much? And I think that's one of the things that you want to try to figure out is why is it happening? Why is it happening? Was there an issue? For instance, obviously he's had some runs after this, but Frosted had the throat surgery after one of the 3-year-old prep races, and so maybe that was something that his body was learning how to do and learning how to deal with, and so I think you have to try to figure out why it happened, but there's nothing specific that I look for a reason as to why it happened. I think it's worth looking at for sure and figuring out what the difference is.
From a handicapping point of view, the things that pop to my mind would be maybe certain trainers who don't ask as much of horses at age 2 and 3. Maybe they're more likely to have horses that develop into 4 and 5-year-olds. And then the other thing is, I bet you if you really studied it, you'd see some breeding angles where just, sort of the reverse of how we look for precocity in our 2-year-olds. There's probably horses who, we know there are bloodlines that tend to be more backward when they're young and come together later. But before we leave this conversation of Frosted and the Met Mile win, I want to get back to Flintshire for a second. But before we go there, I have to ask you, Jonathon, is Frosted a one-turn horse?
No, I don't think Frost is a one-turn horse. He's had, he had the Pennsylvania Derby last year. He had, ran second in the Belmont. I don't think that he's necessarily a one-turn horse, and I don't think Exaggerator is a one-turn horse. I do think Exaggerator will excel at one turn, and Frosted has proven that he'll excel at one turn. So do I think that when Frosted gets stretched out, he's going to run slower than a 123 buyer? Yeah, I do think so. So in a roundabout way, I do think that Frosted will excel more as a one-turn horse, but I don't think that he's going to have too many more opportunities to do that.
There was the walk back on Exaggerator I've been looking for, folks. Let's go back to Flintshire for a sec. Mike, you got something to say?
Pete, you remind me at an old job. I had a client that would ask the same question about 20 times until she got the answer she wanted, and you reminded me of her for just a second there.
I'm sure she was a fine employee, Mike.
She was a fantastic client. Yes.
Oh, that's great. All right, Flintshire. Before we move on, I mean, for me, Jonathon, I thought, made the best case on the podcast for why this horse was going to be 100%. Lived up to billing. We've talked about that. But, I mean, just a very, very simple question, and I'll start with you, Mike. I mean, I think you, of us, were the most, not that you were cynical about him, but compared to me and Jonathon, who bet the race like it had happened the previous day, we're a little more guarded about Flintshire. Do you think he'll lose a race the rest of this year?
Oh, boy. Yeah, I wouldn't bet that he'll lose a race, but I think it's entirely possible. I thought he was the best horse in the field by far. I thought if there was any time to bet against him, it was that race. But I was obviously wrong. I used him as a stone A in the race, but I used some backups like Divisadero, who I actually thought ran the second best race on Saturday in that Manhattan. I thought he ran a big effort, even to get fifth.
I'm surprised you thought he was better than Ironicus, but
I did.
What's your logic there?
He was much more forwardly placed than he normally is. He was sitting third. I think he's usually more of a one-run, and he was wide both turns. I think he was one of the few horses that was wider or traveled more ground than Flintshire did. I think he traveled something like by Trackus like 42 feet further than Ironicus and wasn't beaten by much. I think it was a sneaky good effort. I think it's one that's going to get overlooked by a lot of people.
And especially if my point is right about if dropping the rail made the inside better, that would downgrade Ironicus a little bit and upgrade him a little bit more. You can pick, Chris, whether you want to talk about another horse who ran in the Manhattan or just another horse on the card on the Belmont Day undercard. But any other impressive performances, things you'd want to call out and note particularly?
I thought kind of a buried in that day was Chad Brown sent out a horse. I'm trying to remember his name. Connect. That was the name of the horse. A 3-year-old who's lightly raced. He stretched him out. He was pretty impressive. He may be a horse to watch going forward as another 3-year-old that might emerge as, someone who could compete with the top 3-year-olds going forward. That was the one horse that I took away. I want to try to keep track of him. Chad Brown's been red hot. I thought Ironicus looked really good. I think if you switch him and Flintshire's trips, he beats Flintshire. And if you watch the gallop out, he galloped out right past Flintshire. And he got stopped cold right when he needed to be on.
Oh, I didn't even notice that watching it in the 2 times I have. He did not have a clean journey down there?
Oh, no. He had lost all momentum about 16th of a mile out, had to wait, and finally shook clear, and at the gallop out, flew right past Flintshire. So I think Ironicus is a really good horse, and I really think those two could dominate the turf racing. I really think Ironicus is going to win quite a few races before the year's over.
Jonathon, where do you stand? Well, let me ask you first, how many times have you watched this replay? I know you always do the trip work for California. I don't know if you've done any trip work for Belmont Day yet.
I haven't watched it very much, but I have heard like 17 times about the trouble. It's funny when you're playing a race and you have a single, you sometimes miss the trouble behind because you
watch the race terrible. Yeah, you barely watch. You're just watching your horse.
Exactly. So that's the only horse I watched was Flintshire in there. So, but to your question, I think Carina Mia was phenomenal, and I'm really excited to watch her the rest of the year. She appears to be really special.
Yeah, she's something else. That was a very impressive win in front of a good looking field. Mike, any other horses on the card we want to note before we move on to our last couple of topics here on the show?
Absolutely. I think we can't end the show without talking a little bit about Celestine, who ran so impressively in such a wide open, at least on paper, it looked like a wide open just a game. She crushed that field. And, going back to what we said at the top of the show about Tepin, did you guys see what Belmont came out and said after that race?
I did not catch the quote.
He said, it's a good thing that Miss Temple City and Tepin were over in Ascot because I'm not sure either one of them would have beaten Celestine in the Just a Game. Some strong words. Well,
it's hard to disagree, though.
Absolutely, but those are some strong words from a trainer who doesn't necessarily trash talk too much.
She's not a braggart, that's for sure. She comes up with a 107 speed figure, a perfect trip of her own making. I thought it was really interesting. The people who know horseflesh, including both Richard Migliori and Maggie Wolfendale of NYRA, both highlighted how good she looked before the race. It was a super impressive performance. How about those fighting words from Belmont, Jonathan? Do you think he's onto something with that? Or I mean, obviously he said it before Tepin went halfway across the world under adverse conditions and won the Queen Anne. But you think there's any validity to those remarks?
No, because Tepin gets the exact same trip that Celestine did, a forward trip like that, and you have to think based on what Tepin's done so far. I think she might have buried her. So don't get me wrong.
So you're basically saying, Mr. Mott, slow your roll. That's what you're saying.
Celestine ran huge, and and look, I'm sure he said it in jest. So no big deal.
No. The last thing I mean to imply is that he's become some WWE character here. He's one of my absolute favorite trainers.
Come on,
mild-mannered individual. But it's hard. You're all excited. You're pumped up with adrenaline. Some jerk like me sticks a microphone in your face. What are you supposed to say?
I want to imagine Belmont throwing the gloves down and saying, "Come on."
Do you smell what the Mott is cooking? Chris Larmey, how about this question about where Celestine will rank for you going forward if she has a chance to come up against the likes of Tepin?
I just hope they can settle it on the track.
An excellent desire. Now, the only contests on Saturday were not limited to the course out there at Belmont. We also had the inaugural running of the Belmont Stakes Betting Challenge. Very successful event. They got 51 players putting up $10,000, another sign in the market that is out there in the world for these live bankroll contests. And what a story with the winner, 37-year-old Garrett Skiba. Now, Chris, you're a bit of a contest historian. Let's talk this through. Going into the weekend, I knew of 3 players in the contest world who'd had more than one six-figure score. Paul Sherman was one, friend of the podcast. Duke Matisse, friend of the podcast, another one. And Garrett Skiba going in after he had won, after he'd won 100 not only at the Breeders' Cup Betting Challenge a few years ago, but also won the inaugural Kentucky Derby Betting Challenge. So now Skiba, 37 years old, 3 six-figure wins. Do you know of anyone else who's near this achievement?
I don't know if I know of anybody who has 3. That's a good question.
Even anybody else with 2?
Oh, well,
do you technically have 2?
Technically, no. Untechnically, sort of. It's kind of hard to tell.
Untechnically, sort of. That's a great response, Chris.
We don't have to be coy about this. We've written about it before that you were partners on the worst beat of all time, Lansdowne NHC ticket when you guys lost $800,000 by what was it, a few millimeters?
Yeah, I mean, and that's why it's tough because it's people that are partners and whose name is on the entry isn't always reflect who all's participating. And also now there's lots of online contests that are 6 figures. I mean, that aren't
not for first though.
With the NHC.
Not for first though. I'm talking about for first.
That's true. Yeah, I don't think there is. He might be the only one. He might be all by himself there.
Jonathan, as somebody who typically is exalted as one of the young guns in the contest world, how does it feel to have another horse racing young person out there grabbing the headlines with his 6-figure scores?
Oh, I love it, especially when it's someone that I like. If it's someone that I don't like, maybe I don't love it as much, but I like Garrett a lot. I know I like Garrett a lot, so I root for him when I see his name atop leaderboards. And he's an aggressive player. He takes stands in lots of the tournaments that I've seen. like he showed with his staying with Curator and having the wherewithal to go really hard and be aggressive on a horse that's 10, 15, 12 to 1, and so it's good to see that he was rewarded with that.
Yeah, we see once again an example of the winning strategy in a live bank event being that the idea of going all in the last race, which Skiba did. We're going to try to get him on the show. He's got some other stuff going on. I'm not sure if we're going to be able to get him or not, but it will be a pleasure if we can eventually welcome G-A-R-E-T-T Skiba to the DRF Players Podcast. Little inside joke there. But the live bankroll contests continue to they continue to make waves in the world. We've of course got the next one coming right on deck, end of the month, Santa Anita Gold Cup contest. We're going to be running still some feeders and qualifiers for that event on the new DRF tournament site, which can be reached at tournaments.drf.com. Jonathan, I know your status is a little bit up in the air for Santa Anita. Chris, do we expect to see your smiling face in the Eddie Logan suite?
Unfortunately, I can't make this one. I have some other commitments, although I would really love to be there. I had a great time there a few weeks ago. I would love to go back.
They do a good job. They do a good job. TQ, Nate Newby, the whole team at Santa Anita, always a lot of fun out there. And boy, this contest schedule, it's been so busy between Monmouth and Naira and now back at Santa Anita. The NHC Tour shaping up to be a real tour this summer, and a stop at Saratoga not too far off. Folks can look for information, hopefully, in the coming weeks about how they might qualify into that event or buy into it. I'll be writing about it, I'm sure, in the pages of Daily Racing Form and on DRF.com. I think we have time to touch on a couple of more quick issues. Mike, I know you had a couple things on the agenda. Which one would you like to talk about?
Well, real quickly, I mean, we don't have to discuss it, but I think it's worth noting that Russell Bays has announced his retirement, all-time winningest jockey in North American history, and as far as thoroughbred racing goes. Worth mentioning, he's a Hall of Famer, certainly will be missed. He's a fantastic rider and an incredible achievement just to stay as sound and healthy as long as he has. So I'm glad he retired at the top of the game. I think he retired, his last race was a win even. So good to see him going out.
Nice. That's got to be the way to do it. Yeah, it's probably not a terrible idea to either try to get him on the show or at the very least get Frank Miramati, who called so many of those wins over the years on the show, to tell us some Russell the Muscle stories.
Or Michael Rona. Yeah.
Michael Rona would be another who'd have those. Jonathan, have you ever heard Frank talk about Russell?
No, but I can assure you that if you can get Frank to tell a story, it's always worth it.
He's just talking about pizza.
I got a funny Frank story real quick. When I was in Monmouth, I was ordering pizza to my hotel. I called Frank Miramati because I knew he was doing this pizza tour. And I was like, Frank, I ordered pizza from so-and-so. Did I make a mistake? He said, hang up, cancel it immediately. I hang up, I cancel it, I call him back. He says, I have 2 pies on the way. Whatever you do, do not tip the guy. I've taken complete care of him. And 45 minutes later, there was delicious pizza at my hotel room.
That's fantastic. That's the equivalent of don't bet that horse, he's 3-legged lame. Cancel that pizza order immediately. Don't let it anywhere near you. Well, if there's one thing Frank, there's 2 things Frank knows. It's how to call a race from a bettor's perspective. He is always giving those salient bits of information. You know where your horse is when Frank is calling a race, and he'll tell you about good pizza. Those things are assured. Any other final thoughts, Chris? We'll start with you. Any last thoughts before we wrap up this Flag Day edition of the pod?
I guess 2 quick things. One is the Golden Gate Pick 6 was kind of a fiasco this Sunday.
Oh boy, that was disappointing.
Any of you participated, but boy, did that turn out to be a potential, biggest day in a long time in Golden Gate. Turned out to be a complete downer. So.
Tell people what happened if they weren't paying attention. I'm not sure everybody follows the news like this crew.
Well, there was this big carryover, and I think the pool ended up at like $5 or $6 million. So all of us horse players were trying to, cash in on the big carryover, and it was going pretty well until the 3rd race in the sequence. 2 of the last 3 races on the card were on the turf, and they said they were taking those races off the turf and that now you would be getting all in those 2 races. So suddenly
they have to do. I mean, when the sequence has started, that's the right move.
Right. I mean, it was just frustrating because they had several races on the turf already, and prior to the pick 6, and the weather was fine. So I guess for some reason the riders decided it was unsafe after the pick 6 started.
It must have been that. It must have been a safety issue.
Yeah, and so I mean, you can't argue with that, but you wonder how the turf course suddenly got so unsafe, in the middle of the card, which was frustrating. But it was very frustrating for the bettors because, a lot of people invested a lot of time and money trying to cash in, and pretty much had, that opportunity taken away from them. So, unfortunately for everybody,
it was pouring rain. Was it not pouring rain? I assume that's why the change.
Nope.
No, the weather was fine. There was no
weird.
change in the weather throughout the day.
Yeah, it was very weird. It must have been something bad.
That's bad. I'm not big on the carryovers. I hope they don't become a big thing, but I think they will. Seems like everybody wants to get on these carryover pictures.
Jackpot carryovers you're talking about. You're talking about specific jackpot.
Yeah, the jackpot where you can only win it if you're the only winning ticket. So they tend to carry over, and the thing that's bad about it is they take a lot of the money over and carry it across.
Yeah,
so
we've talked about it at fairly great length on the show before. Not really the player's best friend, except on these mandatory payout days. So it's a little sad when one goes awry. Jonathan, how about you? Any final thoughts?
Triple Crown's over. Summer's coming, so I'm just going to gear up for hopefully some trips to Del Mar and Saratoga. I'd encourage people, if you've never done that, to hop on whatever travel website you use and see if it's a possibility, because it's definitely worth it.
Come see us at the Paddock Bar in Saratoga. Mike, how about you? Anything going on the site that people should be aware of?
Well, I don't know. I don't know if there's anything going on the site more than what we normally would have. I do want to mention one thing at the risk of opening another big can of worms and leading to another 15-minute discussion.
We don't have time for it, but go ahead and say
I will
deal with it quickly.
I will. I mean, it's old news now, but I think we got to mention what happened with Brian Lynch and his testing positive for marijuana and leading to the scratch of one of Chris's favorite horses, Private Zone. I think it's just kind of silly. I mean, in a day of, we want to make sure that the horses aren't running on banned substances. Look, I don't know if this is the place to spend the time and effort in terms of testing trainers. Certainly you want to make sure jockeys aren't running on any substances while they're riding races, but it just seemed kind of a silly distraction leading up to Belmont Week, I thought.
Yeah, I mean, it was a state racing commission deal. Seemed pretty clear somebody probably dropped a dime on him. Chris, any insider, without giving anything away that you're not supposed to, any insider perspective on that whole thing?
I just heard that Brian Lynch's horses were really eating up their hay like crazy, and they were sort of turning. So it was definitely dangerous. You wouldn't want those horses going on the track with a trainer that had smoked marijuana. So that's all I heard.
God. Amazing sarcasm from Mr. Larmey. You have a serious thought on that?
Just to say, the owners were definitely disappointed. I mean, they had been prepping him for the last 6 months to start his campaign in this race. And watching the race, you have to think he had a pretty good chance to win. But there's other races down the road, and everybody will get past it. So no biggie.
All right, I like that attitude. All right, that's it. We're over time here on this Royal Ascot / Belmont / Flag Day edition of DRF Players Podcast. I want to thank Chris Larmey. I want to thank Jonathon Kinchen. I want to thank Mike Hogan. I want to thank producer Charlie Zeggers. But most of all, I want to thank all of you for listening. We'll be back at the end of the week, and I hope you win all your photos.